The fork hit the marble floor before Kedron Vale even realized he'd dropped it. 6 years of careful control. Gone. In 3 seconds. The harbor restaurant hummed around him. Crystal glasses catching candlelight. Low jazz pressing through the warm air. Waiters moving between tables like they were afraid to make sound. Port Meridian's finest dining room. Reserved 3 weeks in advance. Kedron had booked it for one reason only. His son's birthday dinner. Tavian sat across from him, 6 years old and completely unbothered by the elegance surrounding them. The boy was attacking a bread roll like it personally offended him, crumbs already scattered across his collar, laughing at something only he found funny. Kedron had been watching him with the easy warmth of a man who didn't know his world was about to collapse. Then the scent reached him. Not the seared fish on the table beside them. Not the expensive wine the waiter had just uncorked. Something else. Something his body recognized before his mind caught up. Soft, warm, omega. But not just any omega scent. This one hit differently. This one reached into a locked room inside Kedron's chest and started pulling at things he'd buried deliberately. His pulse jumped. His jaw tightened. He set the fork down, or thought he did, but his hand had already gone rigid, and the silverware clattered loud enough that Tavian looked up mid-chew. "Papa, you okay?" "Fine." The word came out flat, mechanical. He wasn't fine. His instincts were already moving, already scanning the room with the precision of a man who had spent decades staying alive in rooms where danger wore good shoes and better smiles. His gaze cut across the restaurant, table to table, face to face, until it landed on the far corner booth. And stopped. The man was sitting alone. Small frame, dark locks pulled back loosely, head angled slightly down over a cup of tea he wasn't drinking. Dressed simply, too simply for this restaurant, like he'd come here for a reason that had nothing to do with the food. Kedron's breath caught. People believe danger arrives with violence. Sometimes it arrives as a memory. Sitting quietly across the room. 7 years. 7 years since that face had appeared in front of him. 7 years since the name had meant anything more than a scar. Ilaren Kale. The man Kedron had once trusted completely. The one person inside the Vale Syndicate he had let close enough to see the parts of himself he never put on display. The quiet Omega with the brilliant mind and the steady hands and the laugh that Kedron had spent 3 years learning like a second language. The man who had sold Syndicate records to an outside faction. Vanished overnight. Left a message that said 4 words. "Don't look for me." And now he was sitting in the corner of a harbor restaurant in Port Meridian, pretending to study the rim of a teacup like Kedron Vale wasn't standing 15 feet away with his heart slamming against his ribcage. "Papa, you're crushing the fork." Kedron looked down. Tavian was right. The silverware was bent slightly where his grip had locked around it. He placed it on the table carefully. "Sorry, Tav." The boy studied him with those wide dark eyes. Eyes that always seemed older than 6 years had any right to be. "Is someone bad here?" "No." A pause. "Eat your bread." Tavian turned back to the roll, unconvinced but obedient. Kedron did not look away from the corner booth. Ilaren hadn't moved, hadn't looked up, but Kedron's alpha instincts were reading the body language like a document. The tight set of the shoulders, the way the hands curled around the cup a fraction too hard, the angle of the neck suggesting careful avoidance. He knew. Ilaren knew Kedron was there, and he was choosing not to acknowledge it. That fact should have made Kedron angry. It did. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. Something that made the back of his throat tighten. Because the man he remembered had never been afraid of anything. The Omega who had walked into Syndicate boardrooms without flinching, who had corrected Kedron's financial projections in front of 30 senior advisors and been right every single time. The man whose silence always felt chosen, deliberate, never like something imposed from outside. This version of Ilaren looked like silence had been taken from him. Not chosen. Taken. The jazz track shifted. Softer now. Across the restaurant a child at another table started giggling. High and bright. and Kedron watched something happen in the corner booth that stopped him completely. Ilaren flinched, not at the sound of the laugh, at the child making it. His whole body went rigid for exactly 1 second. Then he looked away fast, back to the teacup, jaw working like he was trying to keep something from reaching his face. Kedron filed that away, said nothing, felt the calculation in the back of his mind begin to run. Slow, cold, precise. The way it always ran when something didn't add up and the stakes were high. Tavian laughed again at something on his kid's menu. Ilaren's head moved, just slightly, toward the sound. Kedron stood. The chair pushed back with a soft scrape. The couple at the nearest table looked over. The maitre d' near the entrance straightened instinctively. In Port Meridian, when the Triplet Alpha King moved with that particular energy, rooms responded without being asked. Kedron crossed the floor in measured strides. He reached the corner booth. Ilaren was staring at the table. Ilaren. Nothing. Look at me. The hands around the teacup tightened. 1 breath. 2. Then slowly, like a man bracing for impact, Ilaren lifted his eyes. Kedron felt the fracture happen somewhere behind his sternum. Because the fire was gone. Every sharp edge he remembered. Every quiet intensity that used to challenge him across meeting tables and in private rooms gone. What sat across from him now was exhaustion wearing a familiar face. Fear living behind familiar eyes. Ilaren reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small spiral notebook, uncapped a pen without looking away from Kedron's face, slid the notebook across the table. You were supposed to forget me. Kedron read it once, read it again, laughed once, sharp and short, the sound completely wrong for the restaurant. 7 years, he said quietly. Ilaren didn't move. 7 years, and that's what you write? He pulled the chair out from the opposite side of the booth and sat down without asking. The restaurant was still watching. He didn't care. Ilaren wrote again. Please go back to your table. No. Another line. Your son is waiting. He can wait 2 minutes. Kedron leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping low. Why are you here? Right now. Tonight. Of all the restaurants in this city. Ilaren's pen hesitated over the notebook. Then he turned slightly in his seat. Just enough. The sleeve of his jacket shifted, and Kedron saw it. A small plastic bracelet around his wrist. The kind hospitals put on pediatric patients. White band. Printed code. Too small for an adult's medical ID. A child's bracelet. On Ilaren's wrist. Kedron's blood went cold. He reached forward slowly. Not grabbing, not forcing, just touching the edge of the sleeve, moving it back an inch further. The bracelet was hospital-issued. Recent. The ink on the printed code wasn't faded. He looked up. Ilaren's eyes were already watching him. Steady now, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment, dreading it, and had decided somewhere in the last 30 seconds to stop running from it. He picked up the pen, wrote 4 words. They tried to kill him. The jazz played on. Somewhere behind Kedron, Tavian called out cheerfully that the bread basket was empty and could they please get more. Kedron didn't answer. He couldn't look away from those 4 words. And the question clawing its way up through his chest, the one he wasn't ready to ask out loud yet, had already started to answer itself. Hi viewers. If you found out someone you trusted had been hiding something this big for 7 years to protect a child, would you forgive them? Or would the silence itself be the thing you couldn't get past? Drop your answer in the comments. The notebook sat between them like a detonator. For words. They tried to kill him. Kedron didn't speak. He read the sentence again. Then once more. The way a man reads something his brain refuses to process the first time. The restaurant had gone back to its normal noise. Glasses, low conversation, the jazz track cycling into something with a slow piano lead. But the table in the far corner booth existed in a different atmosphere entirely. Heavier. Pressurized. Kedron finally looked up. Who is he? Ilaren held his gaze. Reached for the pen. Wrote, not here. Yes, here. Kedron's voice was quiet, but the weight behind it wasn't. You've had 7 years to pick a different location. You chose this restaurant, tonight. So we're talking right now. The Omega didn't write anything for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His hands, those careful, precise hands that used to move through financial ledgers like they were playing music, were barely steady. Finally he wrote, I didn't choose this restaurant. Kedron paused. Then why are you here? Ilaren glanced toward the entrance. Just briefly, like checking something. Then back to the notebook. I've been watching this building for 3 weeks. The calculation in Kedron's mind shifted hard. Watching the building. He leaned back, reading the full weight of that sentence. Why? Ilaren's pen moved. Because of who comes here. Kedron felt the silence change shape. Because the only person Kedron could think of who visited the harbor restaurant on a regular schedule, the only person whose pattern was predictable enough to plan around, was himself. He brought Tavian here every month. Same table. Same day. Everyone in Port Meridian's inner circles knew that. Kedron placed both hands flat on the table. Controlled. Deliberate. You've been watching me. Ilaren shook his head. Watching over him. The pen tapped the word him. Not Kedron. Kedron stared at the page. Then slowly turned his head toward the main dining room where Tavian was now attempting to fold his paper napkin into something that vaguely resembled a boat. He turned back. My son. Ilaren didn't write. Just held his gaze. That was answer enough. Something moved through Kedron's chest that he couldn't name cleanly. Not anger. Not exactly. Something more tangled than anger. He studied Ilaren's face. The hollows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there 7 years ago. The way his shoulders sat too high like a man who'd been braced for impact so long he'd forgotten how to relax. The restaurant lighting was warm and amber, and it did nothing to soften how worn down Ilaren looked. The fierce Omega Kedron remembered was not sitting across from him. What was here instead looked like someone who had survived something, quietly, alone, without telling a single person. You disappeared, Kedron said. Ilaren wrote. I know. You left a message telling me not to follow. I know that too. And there was a story. About the records. Kedron's voice stayed controlled, but his eyes were sharp. The syndicate files. Someone said you sold them. Ilaren's hand stilled over the notebook. For one long second he didn't move. Then he wrote. I know what they said. Is it true? The pen went down. Ilaren folded his hands on the table, looked directly at Kedron, and shook his head. Once. Deliberate. No question in it. Kedron's jaw worked. He wanted to press harder. He also knew, somewhere under the anger, that a man trying to deceive him didn't sit in a corner booth watching over a child for 3 weeks without making a single move. A betrayer collected what they came for and left. Ilaren had stayed. Talk to me, Kedron said, then caught himself. Looked at the notebook. Right. Ilaren picked up the pen. I found something in the records. 7 years ago. Someone inside the structure wanted the next heir removed before the succession became official. I tried to get to you. I didn't make it. Kedron read it twice. Who stopped you? Ilaren hesitated. Wrote, I don't know who ordered it. I only know what they did. He turned his wrist slightly, not showing the hospital bracelet this time, showing the faint raised scar that ran along the lower side of his throat. Small, old, the kind of scar that meant something had been crushed and hadn't healed cleanly. Kedron's eyes stayed on it for 3 full seconds. Your voice, he said quietly. Ilaren nodded. That night in the archives. Kedron didn't move. They took your voice. Ilaren wrote. I got out. That was enough. Tavian's laugh cut across the restaurant again. Bright and completely unguarded. The laugh of a child who had never once felt unsafe in his life. Kedron watched something happen to Ilaren in real time. The way his whole body went still. Not the flinching this time. Something different. Something that looked like restraint. Like a man gripping the edge of his own emotion very hard to keep it from showing. His gaze moved toward Tavian. And it stayed. Too long. Kedron watched it. He watched the exact quality of that look. Not curiosity. Not the way strangers glanced at a child in a restaurant. Something far more specific than that. Something that looked like recognition. Like knowing. Kedron's pulse shifted. He said nothing. He waited. After a long moment, Ilaren pulled his eyes back to the notebook, picked up the pen, wrote 4 words, and slid the paper across the table. They tried to kill him. Kedron read it again, the same sentence from before. But this time his mind was running it through a different frame. Because Ilaren had been watching the restaurant for 3 weeks. Watching Tavian. Looking at the boy with eyes that held something too specific to be explained by concern for a stranger's child. "Who is him?" Kedron asked. His voice came out lower than he intended. Almost carefully. Ilaren's pen hovered. Then he wrote. 1 sentence. Short. The kind of sentence a man writes when he's been carrying it alone long enough that putting it on paper feels like setting down something that's been breaking his back. Your son isn't the only one who survived that night. The jazz piano looped back to its opening phrase. The candle on the table shifted in a breath of moving air. Kedron did not look away from the page. 7 years ago, on a Tuesday night in the middle of October, Ilaren Kale worked late. That wasn't unusual. The Vale Syndicate's financial archives occupied the entire subbasement of the East Wing. Climate-controlled. Keycard access. No windows. Ilaren had spent hundreds of nights down there, running numbers, cross-referencing ledgers, tracing the clean lines of resource movement across the syndicate's sprawling holdings. He was good at it. Better than good. He could read a balance sheet the way other people read faces. Catching the small things, the off-rhythm entries, the numbers that smiled wrong. That Tuesday night, he found something that didn't smile at all. It arrived buried inside a routine transfer log. A subsidiary transaction, the kind that moved money between holding accounts without triggering standard review flags. Small enough to look like maintenance. Timed deliberately across 3 separate fiscal quarters so no single audit would catch it. Ilaren caught it. He sat with it for 40 minutes, pulling thread after thread. By the end, he wasn't looking at routine maintenance anymore. He was looking at a contract. Operational. Coded. But coded in the syndicate's own internal shorthand, the system Ilaren had helped design 2 years earlier, which meant he understood every abbreviation on the page. The contract had one function. Remove the heir before succession locks. No name listed for the heir. No name listed for the client. But the operational window matched the exact time frame of Kedron's succession announcement. And the payment structure ran through a channel that connected 3 layers deep, obscured but traceable, back to an internal source. Someone inside the Vale family structure. Ilaren stared at the page for a long time. His hands weren't steady. He photographed the documents, made 2 encrypted copies. Then he started toward the elevator, heading straight for Kedron's floor, because this wasn't the kind of discovery you sat on for even an hour. This was the kind of thing that changed the shape of everything. He got as far as the archive corridor. That was where they were waiting. He never heard them coming. The lights in the corridor went out first, a single system cut, deliberate, and then there were hands. Multiple. Moving fast. Professional. The kind of hands that knew exactly where to apply pressure and for how long. Something struck the back of his knees and he went down hard on the concrete floor. He tried to call out. He didn't get a sound out, because something closed around his throat. Not hands, something harder, mechanical, and applied force directly to his larynx with the kind of targeted accuracy that said this wasn't improvised. This was planned. He blacked out. When he came back, his face was pressed against cold concrete and his throat felt like a fist was still inside it. He couldn't speak. Couldn't make a sound above a broken whisper. The corridor was empty. His copies were gone. His keycard was still in his pocket, which meant they hadn't needed to take it. They'd already gotten everything they wanted. Except him. He was still alive. That was a mistake on their part. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe leaving him alive was intentional. Leaving him alive with no voice and no evidence and a clear warning of what came next if he stayed in the city and tried to tell anyone what he knew. He made it to the street level. He made it 2 blocks. Then he collapsed against the wall of a parking structure on Dillon Avenue and sat there for 20 minutes trying to get his body to agree to keep moving. He had nowhere to go. Kedron was the only person he trusted enough to tell. But someone inside the family structure had signed that contract. He didn't know who. He didn't know how deep it ran. And if he walked back through the front doors of the Vale building, he couldn't. He had one other problem, too. One he hadn't told anyone, hadn't even let himself fully accept yet in the weeks leading up to that night. He was pregnant. 8 weeks. Barely. Early enough that it didn't show. Early enough that Kedron didn't know because Ilaren had been trying to find the right moment, which in a relationship as complicated and unspoken as theirs had been, wasn't an easy thing to locate. There was no right moment now. There was only a parking structure on Dillon Avenue, a crushed voice, a stolen set of documents, and a target on his back that extended. He understood now to anyone he was connected to. He left the city before sunrise. He sent the message from a burner phone at the train station. Don't look for me. For words that cost him more than any sentence he had ever written. He didn't send an explanation. He couldn't afford one. If Kedron came looking, and he would, Ilaren knew with complete certainty that he would, whoever had sent those men would be watching for exactly that. Every path Kedron followed would be a path back to Ilaren, and by extension to the child. So he disappeared. He crossed 3 state lines in 2 days, found a clinic in a city where no one knew his name, confirmed what he already knew, then spent the next 7 months planning how to stay invisible while carrying the air of the most powerful alpha syndicate on the eastern coast. He managed it, barely. The pregnancy was hard. The silence was harder. The loneliness was the kind of thing that didn't have a word for it. Not in any language Ilaren knew. But the child was born healthy. Strong lungs, bright eyes, a grip that surprised the nurses. Ilaren held him for 6 hours. Then he was gone. Not dead. Not taken violently. Gone in the way that only someone with syndicate-level resources could arrange. Legally processed, quietly filed, disappeared into a placement record that Ilaren wouldn't be able to trace for years. He hadn't expected that. He'd been careful. He'd been invisible. Someone had still found him. And taken the child anyway. He sent Kedron one final message that night. Through an anonymous relay. 3 sentences. There was a child. He is safe. Forgive me. He never received a response. He didn't expect one. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't piece together until much later, was that the message had never reached Kedron at all. Someone had intercepted it. Someone who had known exactly what to watch for, and had been watching the whole time. Back to the present. Back to the corner booth and the candlelight and the soft jazz and the weight of a conversation that had already broken 3 different things Kedron thought he understood about his own life. He read the sentence again. Your son isn't the only one who survived that night. He looked at Ilaren. Ilaren's face was still. Not blank, still. The difference mattered. Blank was absence. Still was control. The kind of control a person developed when showing too much had cost them too many times. Explain that sentence, Kedron said. Ilaren reached for the notebook. He wrote slowly this time, like the words were heavy. I was pregnant when I left. I didn't know how to tell you before. I was trying to find the right moment and then there was no more time. When I left the city I was 8 weeks along. Carried him alone. I delivered him in January. A boy. Kedron did not move. Ilaren kept writing. I was careful. I thought I was invisible. Someone found the placement anyway. Processed the adoption through the syndicate system. By the time I figured out what had happened, the trail was 6 months old and the records were sealed. Kedron's gaze lifted from the page. His chest felt like something was pressing against it from the inside. You're telling me, he said carefully, that 7 years ago you had my child. Ilaren nodded. And someone took him. Another nod. Through the syndicate. Ilaren wrote. Through official channels. Legitimate paperwork. Someone with enough authority inside the structure to make it clean. Kedron's mind was already running the math. Running it hard. The adoption had gone through syndicate channels. That meant it required authorization from someone with signing authority. That narrowed the field significantly. Syndicate adoption placements, especially sealed ones, needed a senior family signature. His own authority. Or one of his brothers. He sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then his gaze moved across the restaurant, involuntarily, completely beyond his control, and landed on Tavian. The boy had given up on the napkin boat and was now drawing something on the back of his kid's menu with the complimentary crayon the waiter had brought. Tongue just barely visible between his teeth. Fully absorbed. Completely safe in the way that only 6-year-olds who had never been given a reason to feel unsafe could be. Kedron looked at Ilaren. Ilaren was looking at Tavian. With those specific eyes. Those knowing eyes. When was he born? Kedron asked. Ilaren wrote, January 4th. Kedron closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, because Tavian's birthday was January 4th. And the story Kedron had been told, the story the family attorneys and the placement documentation and everything inside the syndicate record had confirmed, was that Tavian had been found through a private humanitarian placement program. A young Omega parent, unknown, had surrendered the child voluntarily due to circumstances beyond their control. Unknown. Kedron had accepted that. He had never once questioned it. Because the paperwork was clean and the boy was healthy and Kedron had been given no reason to pull the thread. He opened his eyes. He looked at Ilaren. They told me he was surrendered voluntarily, Kedron said. By an anonymous Omega. No known identity. Placement processed through the syndicate humanitarian program. Ilaren's pen moved. I didn't surrender him. 3 words. Kedron's jaw tightened. I know, he said, because he did know. He knew it now with the kind of certainty that didn't need more evidence. He knew it in the same place his instincts had been trying to show him something since the moment that scent hit him 40 minutes ago. The math was exact. The timeline aligned. The eyes, those careful, too-old eyes in a 6-year-old face, were Ilaren's eyes. He had been raising his own son. He just hadn't known whose arms that son had come from. The emotional weight of that landed somewhere behind Kedron's ribs and sat there, spreading outward, difficult and complicated and too large to process cleanly at a restaurant table. He pressed forward anyway. Ilaren. The Omega looked up. When you realized where the boy had been placed, Kedron paused. How long have you known it was him? Ilaren wrote. 8 months. I found the placement record last year. It took me 3 more months to confirm he was being raised by you. Then I spent 3 weeks watching before tonight. Watching to see if he was safe. Yes. Is that why you didn't come to me directly? Because you weren't sure if I was the one who ordered the placement. Ilaren's pen stopped. He didn't write anything for a long moment. Then he wrote, I didn't know who to trust. Kedron looked at the sentence. He thought about being in an archive corridor with no voice and no evidence and no way to know which direction the danger was coming from. He thought about 8 weeks pregnant and 3 state lines and January 4th. He thought about raising a boy for 6 years and never once wondering hard enough. He leaned forward. I need you to write down everything you remember about the placement. Every detail. Every name on the paperwork. Ilaren was already nodding. He wrote quickly now. For lines. Names, file numbers, a notation about a secondary authorization code she had managed to photograph before the record was resealed. Kedron read it. Then read the second name on the authorization line. And the warmth in the room went away. Ilaren watched him. He saw the exact moment Kedron found it. He saw the color change in Kedron's face. Because the second name on that authorization line wasn't an administrator. It wasn't a placement officer. It wasn't anyone outside the family. Kedron looked up. His voice came out quiet. I need you to write one more thing. He pushed the notebook back. Write down who you think signed off on the adoption. Ilaren hesitated. Then he wrote. One name. Kedron read it. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat with the name in front of him, 3 syllables, someone he had eaten breakfast with that morning, someone who had given Tavian a birthday gift 2 weeks ago and had laughed with the boy and had sat at the same table as Kedron, and felt the ground shift underneath everything. Because the person who signed that file hadn't been protecting anyone. Or maybe they had. And the difference between those two things was the question that was going to determine what happened next. Ilaren wrote one more sentence. I didn't raise him. Kedron stared at it. For words that shouldn't have been possible. Because if Ilaren hadn't raised the child, and Kedron hadn't known the child was Ilaren's, then someone had made that arrangement happen deliberately. Had taken the boy from the person who should have been raising him and placed him exactly where the family needed him to be, without either of his parents knowing the full truth. That was not an accident. That was architecture. Kedron stood up. Not abruptly. Not with the sharp energy of a man losing control. He stood the way he always stood when he'd made a decision. Fully, deliberately, with the kind of quiet authority that said the next phase had already begun. Come with me, he said. Ilaren didn't move. Kedron tilted his head toward the back of the restaurant. A private seating alcove near the kitchen corridor, separated from the main floor by a frosted partition, reserved for confidential business conversations. He'd used it before. Not asking, he said. Ilaren looked at the notebook in his hands. Then at the main dining room where Tavian had switched from drawing to trying to balance a sugar packet on the edge of his fork. He stood. They moved to the alcove. Kedron spoke quietly to a staff member on the way, 2 sentences, and within 90 seconds Tavian was relocated to a table directly adjacent to the alcove with a second bread basket, a coloring sheet, and a young hostess named Ren who had younger siblings and knew what to do with a 6-year-old. Then Kedron pulled the partition. Just the two of them. The noise of the restaurant dropped to a murmur. Ilaren sat down across from him and opened the notebook without being asked. Kedron looked at the name he'd written. Let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, Tell me the part 1 don't have yet. From the beginning of the placement. Walk me through what happened after you delivered him. Ilaren wrote for several minutes without stopping. The story came out in careful, precise sentences. No flourishes. No emotion in the language itself, but the facts were emotional enough on their own. After the birth, Ilaren had relocated to a smaller city. He had the boy with him for 11 days. He was still recovering physically, still rebuilding his ability to function without a voice, still learning how to navigate a world that required verbal communication in a way he no longer had. He had a system. A small apartment. Plan. On the 12th day, he came back from a 2-hour trip to the pharmacy to find the apartment empty. Child. Gone. No sign of forced entry. A single piece of paper on the kitchen table. For words. He is somewhere safe. No signature. No location. No contact information. Ilaren stopped writing. Looked at the notebook for a moment. Then wrote one more line. I spent 6 months trying to find him before I found the placement record. And the record showed the syndicate placement program, Kedron said. Yes. And my name as the receiving guardian. Ilaren met his eyes. Yes. Kedron was quiet. He turned that over, the image of Ilaren finding that record. Finding his name on it. Trying to process what it meant with no way to know if Kedron had ordered the child taken or if Kedron himself had been kept in the dark. You thought I did it, he said. Ilaren wrote. I didn't know. I thought you might have found out about the pregnancy and decided to handle it the way the syndicate handles everything. Cleanly. Quietly. Without asking. And that's why you didn't come directly to me. He wrote. If you had ordered it, coming to you meant walking into the same structure that had already taken my voice. I needed to know what I was walking into first. Kedron looked at the table. He could be angry about that. He had been, briefly, somewhere in the last 5 minutes. He also understood it with a clarity that made anger feel like the wrong tool. What changed? He said. Ilaren hesitated. Then wrote. I got close enough to watch him. For 3 weeks. I watched the two of you. I needed to see if he was being taken care of or if he was being used. And he was being loved. 2 words. Just those 2. Kedron sat back. Something moved through him. complicated, layered, the kind of feeling that had too many threads to name cleanly. The 6 years he had spent raising Tavian played back against itself in a single compressed second. Every birthday, every early morning, every time the boy had climbed into his bed at 3 a.m. because of a nightmare and Kedron had stayed awake until he fell back asleep. Every school drop-off. Every conversation about why the sky stayed blue and whether fish dreamed and what made a person a good person. 6 years. And this man across the table had spent the last 3 weeks sitting outside that life, watching it, confirming it, needing proof before he could allow himself to believe the child was okay. Kedron looked at Ilaren. Really looked. The exhaustion. The careful movements. The way he held the notebook like it was the only reliable tool he had left. "You've been alone since you left," Kedron said. It wasn't a question. Ilaren didn't write anything. That was its own answer. Kedron leaned forward. "I need to know who authorized the placement. Not just the second signature, the original order. The person who went to your apartment on day 12. Ilaren wrote. "I don't know who physically came. But the paper on the table used the same syntax as internal syndicate memos. Same structure. Someone who had worked inside the organization for years. Which means it's not an outside threat. No, it's internal." He nodded. Kedron sat with that. He thought about the name on the authorization file. Thought about the person who had sat at his breakfast table that morning. The person who had held Tavian's hand walking through the harbor 2 weeks ago. The person who knew every security protocol the Veil Syndicate ran. His brother. His own blood. Someone inside the family had lied to both of them. Separated a parent from a child. Taken a voice. Built a story clean enough that no one had questioned it for 6 years. And somewhere behind that story was a reason. Kedron didn't know yet if the reason was protection or something colder. He grabbed the notepad, wrote one line himself, pushed it across to Ilaren. "I need you to stay in this building until I make one call." Ilaren read it, looked up. Something in his expression shifted, not quite resistance, but close. The instinct of a man who had been surviving by staying mobile. Kedron held his gaze. "I know what you're thinking. I'm not asking you to trust the whole structure. I'm asking you to trust that I'm not the one who moved against you." Ilaren was quiet. Then he wrote, "Why should I believe that?" "Because," Kedron said, "if I had ordered it, Tavian would never have known your name, and he already does." Ilaren's pen stopped. His eyes moved. Kedron watched the question form on his face before he wrote it. He wrote, "You told him my name?" "I told him about the Omega who used to work inside the syndicate. The one who was brilliant and careful and trusted me more than most people got to. I didn't tell him everything. But I told him the name." Ilaren stared at the notepad. His hand was shaking slightly. Just slightly. Kedron reached across the table. Not grabbing, not forcing. Just placed his hand over Ilaren's. Stopped the trembling. "You should have come to me," he said. Ilaren wrote slowly. "I thought you were the one who ordered it." The partition shifted slightly in the airflow from the kitchen. Beyond it, Tavian's laugh broke through the murmur of the restaurant. Bright and easy and completely unaware of what was happening 15 feet away. Kedron pulled his hand back, reached for his phone, because there were 2 people in the Veil Syndicate with enough authority to sign that placement file. One of them was him. The other was one of his brothers, and he was calling both of them right now. Only one of them was going to answer without hesitation. The other one was going to pause. That pause was going to tell Kedron everything. His thumb hovered over the contact list. And then, from somewhere near the restaurant entrance, a sound reached him. Not loud, but wrong. The particular quality of silence that falls when a room of people suddenly become aware of something they don't want to be looking at but can't stop. Kedron went still. His hand dropped from the phone. Ilaren's head had already turned toward the partition. His eyes were sharp, alert, the exhaustion replaced instantly by something older, survival instinct, the kind you develop when you've been hunted. He grabbed the notebook, wrote 3 words, fast. "They found me." Kedron stood. The sound came from near the entrance. Not loud. Not violent. Not yet. Just wrong. The particular stillness that falls over a room when something walks in that doesn't belong. When the air pressure shifts and people stop talking without knowing why and their eyes move toward the door without being told to. Kedron was already moving. He came through the partition in 3 steps, crossed to Tavian's table, and put his hand on the boy's shoulder with the calm of a man who had practiced keeping his face neutral in high-pressure rooms since he was 19 years old. "Finish the bread," he said quietly. "Don't move from this chair." Tavian looked up. Read his father's face the way children of powerful people learn to read it, not panicking but filing it away carefully. He nodded and looked back at the coloring sheet. Kedron turned to the entrance. 2 men. Suits. Not restaurant suits. The wrong cut. Too structured at the shoulders. Too deliberate in the way they stood just inside the door scanning the room. Not dining. Looking. The maitre d' was already beside them, speaking in low tones. Kedron pulled out his phone. He called Varix first. 1 ring. 2. "Pick up," he said under his breath. 3 rings. Varix answered. "What's wrong?" "I need you and Soren at the harbor restaurant. Now." "Not in 20 minutes. Now." A pause. Short. "We're 20 minutes out." 15. He ended the call. He turned back toward the alcove. Ilaren was already standing at the partition's edge, watching the 2 men near the entrance with the focused attention of someone who had spent years learning to read threat levels in rooms. His eyes moved to Kedron. He wrote in the notebook without sitting down. Held it up. "I've seen the one on the left before. 3 months ago. Outside my building." Kedron read it. Looked at the man. Memorized the face. "They followed you here." Ilaren shook his head. Wrote, "I wasn't followed. I checked. They were already here." That was worse. That meant someone had known Ilaren would eventually come to this restaurant. Someone had been patient enough to place assets in advance rather than tail him directly. That kind of operation required intelligence, resources, and most importantly, it required knowing exactly what Ilaren was moving toward before Ilaren had even decided. Someone inside the syndicate. Still, after 7 years. Kedron stepped closer to Ilaren and lowered his voice. "Can they see you from the entrance?" Ilaren turned slightly, considered the sightlines, shook his head. "Good. Stay behind the partition. Don't go to the main floor." Ilaren wrote, "Your son is on the main floor." "I know." He looked toward Tavian. The hostess Ren was still there, chatting easily, doing her job. "He's fine for 2 more minutes." Ilaren wrote again. Faster this time. "They're not here for me." Kedron looked at the notebook. "They're here for Tavian." The room narrowed. Kedron felt his alpha instincts lock in, hard, cold, completely operational, the way they did in moments where everything except the immediate problem became irrelevant noise. He moved back to Tavian's table without showing urgency, crouched beside the boy's chair. "Hey, change of plans. We're going to move to the back dining room." Tavian looked up. "Why?" "Because your old man wants better dessert options." The boy considered this, decided it was plausible, slid off the chair. Kedron straightened, caught the hostess Ren's eye, tilted his head toward the back corridor. She read it correctly and moved ahead of them without making it look like movement. Kedron kept his body between Tavian and the entrance the entire way. They were in the back corridor when the front door opened again. Varix and Soren arrived in 12 minutes. That was worth noting. They were supposed to be 20 minutes out. They made it in 12, which meant they had already been moving toward this part of the city when Kedron called. He filed that away. Both brothers entered through the staff entrance. They knew the building, they'd been here before, and found Kedron in the back dining room with Tavian coloring at a corner table and Ilaren standing against the far wall with a notebook in his hands and his eyes tracking everything. Varix saw Ilaren first. His face did something complicated. Not shock exactly. Something closer to recognition landing on top of something he'd been expecting. Soren saw Ilaren second, and didn't look at him at all. That was the thing. That was the detail. In a room where a person who had been missing for 7 years had just reappeared, the natural human response, even for a man with Soren's composure, was to look, to register, to let the shock show for at least 1 second. Soren looked at Kedron, then at Tavian, then at the floor. Never once at Ilaren, like a man who already knew who was standing against that wall. Kedron watched all of it, said nothing. Varric spoke first. Kedron, what happened? 2 men at the front entrance, placed in advance, not tailing, waiting. Kedron's gaze moved between his brothers. Either of you want to tell me something before I start asking questions that are going to be harder to answer? Varric frowned. What kind of question? The kind with a name attached. Kedron pulled out the notebook, opened it to the authorization page, set it on the table face up. Both brothers looked at it. Varric went rigid. Soren went still. Different reactions. That mattered. Rigid was surprise. Still was recognition. Ilaren slid one more sentence across the table toward Kedron. Check the adoption file. The full version. Not the copy they gave you. Kedron picked up his phone. Called the Syndicate Records manager directly. Asked for the original sealed adoption file to be accessed and the full authorization trail sent to his secure line. Then he looked at Soren. This is going to be a long night, he said quietly. Soren finally met his eyes. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. Something that looked like a man who had made a decision he believed in, and was now sitting across from the moment where he'd have to explain it. The file arrived on Kedron's phone 40 seconds later. He opened it, scrolled to the legal guardian signature line. Read the name. Soren Vale. Not a clerical error. Not a procedural placeholder. A full legal signature. With a date 7 years back. Kedron set the phone down on the table face up. Nobody spoke. Tavian colored quietly in the corner. And Soren finally looked at Ilaren. For the first time since walking into the room. Like a man who had been waiting 7 years for this exact conversation to begin. Kedron moved Tavian to a separate room. He didn't explain. He told the boy there was a business conversation happening and that Ren would stay with him and there would be chocolate cake if he could sit quietly for 30 minutes. Tavian accepted this negotiation with the dignity of someone who understood that adults sometimes needed rooms without children in them. The door closed. Kedron turned around. Talk, he said, not to both brothers. To Soren. Varric stood to the side with his arms crossed. He hadn't said a word since reading the authorization line. That was its own kind of answer. Varric's silence meant he was processing, not deflecting. He hadn't known. Soren had. Soren had known for 7 years. He stood near the window with the particular posture of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head 100 times and was now discovering that rehearsal and reality felt nothing alike. He looked older than he had an hour ago. Or maybe Kedron was just seeing him differently. The syndicate was fracturing, Soren said. His voice was steady, controlled. But underneath the control was the weight of something that had been held for a very long time. 7 years ago, we had 3 separate factions running internal pressure campaigns against the succession. You know that. We all know that. What you didn't know, what I didn't tell you, was that 2 of those factions had identified a potential heir. Kedron said nothing. They didn't know who the Omega was. They didn't know a pregnancy existed. But they had intelligence that suggested a bonded connection between you and someone inside the organization. And they were already planning around it. Planning what? Kedron said. Removal. Soren didn't soften the word. If there was going to be an heir, they wanted to control the circumstances of that heir's existence. Either neutralize the pregnancy before it became leverage someone else could use, or claim the child first. Ilaren was standing near the wall, very still, writing nothing, just listening. Soren looked at him. I found out about the pregnancy before you did, he said. I had someone inside the records department monitoring unusual medical filings connected to the syndicate's extended network. Ilaren had used a clinic in our coverage territory. The record flagged. Ilaren's jaw tightened. I didn't tell Kedron, Soren continued, because at that point I didn't know if the intelligence leak that had already reached the factions had come from inside Kedron's inner circle. I couldn't risk the information moving further until I knew the source. Kedron's voice came out flat. So you made a unilateral decision. I made the only decision that kept the child alive. For the first time, Soren's voice lost some of its control. Not much, but enough. The attack in the archives, that wasn't my operation. I found out about it after. Whoever sent those men moved faster than I anticipated. Ilaren was already gone by the time I had a counter in place. He looked at Ilaren directly. When I found out what happened to you, what they did to your voice, I couldn't reach you. You were already in transit. You went dark completely. He paused. That was actually the right call. Ilaren's expression didn't change. Soren kept going. When the boy was born, I had one window to move. The factions were still active. If a child with Vale blood entered any public record under Ilaren's name, there would be a trail. A trail meant a target. He looked at Kedron. I took the child from the placement location Ilaren had arranged, filed the paperwork through the humanitarian program, placed him with you under a sealed record. Kedron stared at him. You took a newborn from his parent without telling either of us. I kept a child alive who otherwise would have been used as a political instrument by people who would not have hesitated to destroy him the moment he stopped being useful. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of a room full of people who were all holding some version of right and some version of wrong, and none of the versions fit cleanly together. Varric spoke for the first time. The attack on Ilaren. Who ordered it? Soren's face changed. Just slightly. That's the part one haven't resolved. Kedron looked at him. Meaning I identified the factions. I neutralized 2 of them over the following 18 months. But the operation in the archives was not either of those factions. He paused. It was a single actor. Inside the structure. Someone who had known about Ilaren and Kedron before any of the factions did. Someone with enough access to move undetected, and enough reason to want the Omega specifically silenced rather than just removed. Ilaren picked up the pen. Wrote, You never found who it was. Soren shook his head. I thought I had. 3 years ago. The lead went cold. He looked at Ilaren. And then 8 months ago there was movement again. Someone inside the current syndicate structure started pulling old placement records. Accessing sealed files. Kedron straightened. Someone was looking for the boy, Varric said. Someone was confirming where the boy ended up, Soren corrected. Which means they already knew a child existed. They were verifying the location. The weight of that moved through the room, because verifying a location was not curiosity. Verifying a location was preparation. Ilaren's pen was already moving. He wrote and pushed the notebook toward Kedron without looking up. That's why they were at the entrance tonight. Not for me. They already knew where the boy was. Tonight was confirmation. Kedron read it. The cold in his chest expanded. Who's still inside the structure with that level of access? He said. Soren opened his mouth. And then the window behind him shattered. Glass. Everywhere. The sound hit first. A sharp, explosive crack. Then the spray of shattered window across the back wall and the floor and Soren's jacket as he dropped instinctively. Kedron was already moving. He had cleared the center of the room before the second sound came. Not glass this time, a different register. The flat, compressed pop of a suppressed shot striking the wall above where he'd been standing. Sniper. Outside. Elevated position. Kedron hit the floor behind the heavy side table, pulling the table over as a barrier in the same motion. His mind was running threat assessment faster than he could fully articulate. Window angle, trajectory, the direction the shot had come from, whether the shooter had a clear line on the room's interior corners. Varix was already low, moving toward the door to the hallway where Tavian was. Soren had his back against the wall beside the broken window, breathing controlled, unhurt. Kedron's head turned toward the far corner. Illiren was gone. Not hiding. Gone. The wall where he'd been standing was empty. 1 second of cold panic, the kind Kedron hadn't felt in years, and then the side door to the kitchen corridor opened and Illiren came through it moving fast, low, with the kind of efficiency that said he'd been tracking the threat from a different angle entirely. He grabbed Kedron's arm, pulled him toward the kitchen corridor, wrote fast on the notebook while moving. Street level. 2 shooters. 1 elevated, 1 on foot near the East Service exit. Kedron stared at him. You saw them. He nodded, kept writing. I've been watching the perimeter for 3 weeks. I know this building's lines. The elevated shooter is set back. There's a 15-second window after each shot for repositioning. The foot shooter is moving toward the boys' room. Kedron was running before the last word was written. The kitchen corridor connected to the private back rooms through a narrow service hall. He covered it in seconds, pushed through the door. Tavian was on the floor. Ren had pulled him down under the heavy prep table the moment the glass broke. Smart, fast, no hesitation. The boy's face was white, but he wasn't crying. He was watching the door with those 2 old eyes, and when Kedron came through it, the held breath in the room released all at once. Papa. 1 word. That was all Tavian said. I've got you. Kedron picked him up, pressed him close. Keep your head down. The service exit door at the end of the corridor rattled. Handle moving. From outside. Kedron set Tavian behind the prep table, put his hand on the boy's shoulder, stay, and moved toward the door. The handle moved again, then stopped. Then the door swung open fast. Kedron was already in position, but the person who came through wasn't the foot shooter. It was Illiren. He had come around the outside of the building through the kitchen delivery entrance, moving through whatever blind spot the perimeter had, and come in from behind the shooter's position. He was bleeding, left arm, not severe, but real. He didn't stop moving. He pushed past Kedron, went straight to the prep table, dropped to his knees in front of Tavian. Kedron watched. He watched Illiren put both hands on Tavian's face. That careful, precise gesture, and look at the boy with an expression that Kedron had no adequate word for. Not the look of a stranger checking an injured child. Not even the look of a concerned adult. The look of someone who had been thinking about this exact face for 6 years. Tavian looked back at him. You're bleeding, the boy said. Illiren nodded. Does it hurt? Illiren hesitated, then shook his head, not convincingly enough, because Tavian's face said he didn't fully believe it. You came from outside, Tavian said. You were watching. Illiren went still. The boy studied him with that precise attention. You're the one who's been outside, aren't you? I saw you once. 3 weeks ago. Near the window. He tilted his head. Papa never noticed. But I did. Illiren's face broke open. Just for a moment. Just enough. Kedron saw it from across the room and felt something in his own chest fracture quietly along a line he hadn't known was there. Varix appeared in the kitchen doorway. Shooter 1 is down. Soren had a secondary weapon. Shooter 2 retreated. Building security has the perimeter locked. Who sent them? Kedron said. Working on it. Varix looked at Illiren, then at the arm. He needs a doctor. I know. Kedron crossed the room, crouched beside the prep table. He looked at Illiren, at the blood on the jacket sleeve, at the hands still resting near Tavian's shoulders, at the face that had been carrying too much weight for too long. Illiren picked up the notebook, one-handed, slow, wrote, He's okay. He's okay, Kedron said. Illiren exhaled. Not dramatically, not with collapse, just a slow exhale. The kind that comes after you've been holding something for a very long time and someone finally gives you permission to put it down. Tavian reached over and took Illiren's hand. Not asking, not hesitating, just took it, like it was the obvious thing to do. Illirin looked at the small hand wrapped around his fingers and didn't move. Kedron watched both of them, quietly furious, quietly broken, quietly certain of something he hadn't been certain of in 7 years. He stood up. "We need to move," he said. "And when we're somewhere safe, we're finishing this conversation." He looked at Illirin. "All of it." Illirin nodded. And for the first time since Kedron had walked across that restaurant floor tonight, he didn't look like he was planning to run. The Vale Safe House on Archer Point sat on the edge of the harbor's north cliff. 3 floors, reinforced structure, security system that Kedron had personally redesigned 18 months ago after the last threat assessment. He brought Tavian here and put the boy to bed in the second-floor room with the window facing away from the water, checked the locks, sat beside him until his breathing went deep and even. Then he came downstairs. Illirin was in the main room. A syndicate doctor had come and gone in 40 minutes. Cleaned the arm wound, stitched the exit point of a graze that had been closer than Illirin had let on, left a care sheet that Illirin set aside without reading. He was sitting at the long table. Notebook in front of him. Not writing, just sitting. Kedron poured 2 glasses of water. Set one in front of Illirin. Sat across from him. The room was quiet. Outside the cliff, the harbor made its low sound. "The doctor said something to me before he left," Kedron said. Illirin looked up. "He was checking your records from the syndicate's old medical system. The ones that were never fully closed out." He paused. "He said there's something called bond deterioration." He explained what it meant. Illirin's face was very still. "He said that when 2 people are bonded at the biological level, the way alphas and omegas bond, and then separated for an extended period without a formal dissolution, the bond doesn't disappear." Kedron kept his voice even. "It degrades, and depending on how long the separation holds, the deterioration creates physical effects. In both people." Illirin picked up the pen, set it down without writing. 7 years, Kedron said. Illirin looked at the table. "The doctor said 7 years of bond deterioration without intervention is close to the threshold. Not past it, but close." He leaned forward. "Were you aware of this?" A long pause. Then Illirin nodded. Kedron breathed once. Slowly. "For how long?" He picked up the pen. 2 years. Kedron read it. "You've been deteriorating for 2 years and you didn't." He stopped himself. Reset. "Why didn't you find a way to tell me?" Illirin wrote. "Because I thought you had moved on. I thought telling you would be forcing something on you that you hadn't chosen. You didn't know the bond hadn't dissolved. Why would I appear after 7 years and tell you that you're dying slowly because of me?" Kedron stared at the page. "That was not your decision to make alone." Illirin wrote. "Every decision I've made for 7 years has been alone." The sentence sat between them. Kedron didn't respond immediately. He thought about what that actually meant. 7 years of silence. 7 years of carrying a pregnancy and losing a child and finding a trail and watching from outside a window. 7 years of knowing the bond was fraying and saying nothing because telling the truth felt like placing a burden on someone who had already been wronged enough. He thought about how a person builds that kind of silence, year by year, until it stops feeling like a choice and just feels like how things are. "I'm not moving on," Kedron said. Illirin looked up. "I was never moving on. I was just moving." He held Illirin's gaze. "There's a difference." Illirin wrote. "You deserve a normal life. A chosen one. Not a biological obligation pulling you back to someone who disappeared without warning." Kedron picked up the notebook, turned to a fresh page, wrote his own sentence, slid it across. "Tell me one thing you chose in the last 7 years that wasn't about survival." Illirin read it. His hands went still on the table. Kedron waited. After a long moment, Illirin picked up the pen, wrote, "Watching Tavian through the window. I didn't have to do it in person. I could have stayed away entirely, but I came." He hesitated, added one more line. "That was the only thing I chose for myself. Just to see him." Kedron read it twice. The man across the table from him had lost his voice, lost his child, spent 7 years in the kind of isolation that doesn't have a clean name, and the one thing he had claimed for himself, the single act of choosing rather than surviving, was standing outside a harbor restaurant window looking at a boy he wasn't allowed to acknowledge. Kedron sat back, looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds, then looked at Ilaren. "The bond deterioration is reversible," he said. "The doctor confirmed that. Proximity slows it. Formal acknowledgement can restore it." He paused. "That's not the only reason I'm saying what I'm about to say, but I want you to understand that I know the medical situation, and I'm saying it anyway." Ilaren's pen was in his hand, but he hadn't written anything. "Stay," Kedron said. Ilaren shook his head. Not the answer Kedron had expected. Or maybe exactly the answer he'd expected, which was why the next part mattered. "You're not doing this for me," Ilaren wrote. "You're doing it because the bond is deteriorating and Tavian needs an explanation and the situation requires it." Kedron leaned forward. "I'm doing it," he said quietly, "because the day you disappeared I took apart half this city looking for you. Not because of the bond. Not because of obligation. Because you were the one person inside this entire structure who looked at me and saw the actual person and not the position." He paused. 7 years didn't change what I know about you. It just added to the list of things you survived that I should have been there for." Ilaren's jaw worked. Kedron reached across the table, wrapped his hand around Ilaren's. "You don't disappear again," he said. "Not a question. Not a request." Ilaren looked at their hands. His shoulders, those tight, braced, too high shoulders that had been holding the weight of 7 years of alone, dropped. Just slightly. Just enough. He didn't write anything. But he didn't pull his hand away either. From upstairs, a small sound. Tavian, turning over in his sleep. Both of them went still, listening. The sound settled. The harbor moved outside. And in the quiet of the safe house on Archer Point, with the pieces of the last 7 years finally laid out across a table between them, something shifted. Not fixed, not resolved, but moving in the right direction for the first time, which for now was enough. 3 days later, Kedron called a full assembly. The Vale Syndicate leadership gathered in the main room of the Archer Point building. 12 people, senior chairs, the full operational circle. This was not a common event. A full assembly meant something had changed at the top level. Something structural. Something that couldn't be addressed through normal channels. People arrived quietly and read the room before sitting down. Kedron stood at the head of the table. He did not open with pleasantries. 7 years ago, he said, a decision was made inside the structure without my knowledge or consent. A person connected to me was attacked and silenced. A child, my child, was taken and relocated without either of his parents being informed of what was actually happening. He paused. That will not go unanswered. The room was completely still. But before we discuss accountability, there is something you need to know. He turned toward the side door. It opened. Ilaren walked in. Not quietly. Not apologetically. He walked in the way a person walks into a room when they have decided, finally, to take up the space that was always theirs. The reaction from the assembly was immediate. Recognition from the ones who had been there 7 years ago. Uncertainty from the newer chairs. One person, a senior operations director named Holt, pushed back in his chair with an expression that moved too fast and landed too hard. Kedron filed that away. Ilaren Kale, Kedron said clearly, former syndicate financial analyst, Omega, and Tavian's parent. The room broke into low noise. Kedron let it run for exactly 4 seconds. Then he raised one hand and the room went quiet. The story you were told about the humanitarian placement program was incomplete. The story about the archived records breach was also incomplete. Those incomplete stories served the interests of people who were protecting their position inside the structure. That ends today. He turned to the table, pulled out a document. 3 pages. Already signed. This is a formal reinstatement of Ilorin Kales standing inside the syndicate. Full clearance. Full acknowledgement of his role as Tavian's Omega parent. And full legal standing as a member of this family. He slid it to the center of the table. No one spoke. Then Holt spoke. You can't reinstate someone who violated syndicate. He didn't violate anything, Kedron said. Flat. Clean. No room in the tone for argument. The breach accusation was fabricated. The records he accessed were legitimate accounting files, and the only thing they contained was evidence of a conspiracy inside this room. Kedron looked directly at Holt. Which is a conversation we will be having separately. Holt's jaw tightened. That was enough confirmation. Soren was in the corner of the room. He hadn't sat at the table. He was standing, present, accountable, carrying the weight of the choices he'd made without apology but also without deflection. Kedron looked at him. Soren made decisions 7 years ago that kept Tavian alive. He also made decisions that kept the full truth from two people who deserved to know it. He paused. Those two things are both real. The process of addressing them will happen inside this family, privately. What matters for this room today is that the structure that allowed a conspiracy to move unchecked inside this organization for 7 years no longer exists as of this morning. He picked up a second document. The covert operational budget that funded the internal faction movements. The subcommittee authorization that allowed sealed files to be processed without primary guardian sign-off. And the financial routing that connected the attack on the Dellen Avenue archive to a specific account inside our own holdings. He set the document down. Dissolved, restructured, and attached to this reinstatement filing as exhibit evidence. He looked at the room. Anyone who wants to challenge the reinstatement is welcome to. The challenge process is outlined in the Standing Governance Charter. It requires 3 senior co-signatures and a full evidentiary hearing. He let that land. I recommend reading the exhibit before deciding. Nobody moved. Ilorin stood near the window throughout all of it. Not performing. Not trembling. Not asking permission. Just standing. Present. After the assembly ended and the room cleared, Kedron found him in the hallway. They stood together for a moment without speaking. The building was quieter now. Staff moving at lower energy. The sharp charge of the assembly dissipating. Power without truth becomes cruelty. And silence is the weapon corruption uses best. Kedron knew that now with the kind of certainty that only comes from living it. 7 years of a lie maintained inside a structure that was supposed to run on accountability. 7 years of a man raising a child and loving him completely and never once knowing who had placed that child in his arms. 7 years of another man watching from outside a window and deciding over and over again that being near was close enough because believing in something closer felt too dangerous. That was over. The door at the end of the hall opened and Tavian came out at a run, skidding on the hardwood floor in his socks, holding a drawing in both hands. He ran straight to Ilorin. I made this, he said. It's us. That's you, that's Papa, that's me. He pointed to 3 figures with considerable artistic confidence. You're the tallest one because I wanted to make you tall. Ilorin took the drawing, looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Tavian with those careful, specific eyes. And slowly he smiled. Full. Real. The first time Kedron had seen it. It looked exactly the way he remembered it. Tavian studied the expression with satisfaction. Are you staying for dinner tomorrow too? Ilorin looked at Kedron. Kedron nodded. Ilorin looked back at the boy and nodded. Tavian grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the kitchen with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who had already decided how things were going to be and saw no reason the adults should have any further input. Kedron watched them go. The hallway was quiet. The harbor light came through the window at the end of the hall and laid itself across the floor in a long pale stripe. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with vengeance. Sometimes it arrives with a chair at the table that should have been there all along. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do, after everything, is simply stay. That was the end of one story. and the beginning of a much better one. If the story moved you, if you've ever had to fight to reclaim your place in a family that should have protected you all along, share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want to be here for the next story, the kind that makes you feel something real, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built for people who believe that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home. Don't miss what's coming next.